Imagine a little girl standing bravely in front of a female judge, whispering words that seemed impossible. "Free my dad and I'll heal you." People laughed at her innocence, yet what happened next would silence every doubt and open hearts in ways no one expected. This is not just a story about law and justice, it's a story about love, forgiveness, and the miracle of family. Stay with us, friends, because what unfolds will move you deeply. Wishing you peace, health, and joy as you listen. And may I ask, what country are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? The snow had been falling since early morning, blanketing Davenport in a quiet stillness that felt almost holy. Families along Main Street strung colored lights across porches and draped evergreen garlands around door frames. Inside the diners, the smell of bacon and brewed coffee warmed the air, while waitresses carried steaming plates and slipped tips into their aprons with practiced grace. Shoppers hustled past storefront windows decorated with toy trains and model sleighs, their arms laden with packages wrapped in red and green. For most, it was the kind of winter's day that invited cheer. But on the edge of town, in a small house that leaned with age, the spirit of the season seemed painfully far away. Caleb Whitmore tugged his worn coat tighter and rubbed his hands together before stepping inside. The drafty old place barely held the heat. Cracks in the window frames allowed icy air to seep through. The wood stove flickered stubbornly, its embers struggling against the chill. A thin curtain swayed as the wind rattled the glass, reminding him that the house had seen better years. His father had built it with pride decades ago, but Caleb had inherited not only the walls but also the weight of keeping them standing. At the kitchen table, his daughter Elara sat hunched over, her small face pale against the blanket draped across her shoulders. The blanket was too big, swallowing her frame, but she clutched it like a shield. A soft cough escaped her lips before she leaned into her stuffed bear, its worn fur pressed against her cheek. She lifted her eyes, fragile but determined, and whispered, "Daddy, I'm okay. Don't worry." Caleb swallowed hard. He wanted to nod, to smile, to reassure her that she would be fine. But every rasp in her throat sounded like a clock ticking down. He thought of the pharmacy downtown, of Michael Doyle shaking his head earlier that day, explaining politely but firmly that the prescription couldn't be released without payment. Caleb had slid his card across the counter, hoping against hope, declined, always declined. In the corner of the kitchen, Marjorie Whitmore moved slowly, pouring hot water over a tea bag in a chipped mug. Her hands shook slightly as she set the mug down in front of her son. The years had not been easy on her, but her eyes still carried a quiet strength. "Caleb," she said softly, "family is the only thing we've got left. Don't forget that. We'll get through this somehow." He nodded, though his heart disagreed. Somehow felt thin, like the weak flame in the stove that barely warmed the room. He sipped the tea, its bitterness matching the ache in his chest. His mother's words rang true, but they didn't answer how he was supposed to find the medicine his daughter needed. Elara coughed again, sharper this time. Caleb set down the mug and moved to her side, placing a hand on her back. Her breathing came shallow, each inhale a little battle. She looked up at him with eyes far older than her 6 years, eyes that seemed to understand the weight he carried. He brushed her hair back from her forehead, wishing he could lift the sickness out of her body with a single touch. The bells of St. Paul's Church drifted faintly through the frosty air outside, marking the hour. Across town, the diner on the corner of Main and 4th filled with laughter as families finished their meals and left tips on the counter. Teenagers hurried past the windows, their voices bright with plans for the holiday break. But inside the Whitmore home, the silence deepened, heavy with the knowledge that joy belonged to other people this year. Caleb rose from the table and walked to the window. The frost had spread like lace across the glass, catching the dim glow of the street lamp beyond the yard. Snowflakes drifted down without hurry, each one vanishing as it touched the porch rail. He pressed his hand against the cold pane and stared at his own reflection, a man barely in his mid-30s, but worn down, with lines carved deep around his eyes. His shoulders sagged under the kind of burdens that never seemed to lift. Behind him, Elara shifted in her chair, hugging the bear close. The blanket slipped from her shoulders, and Marjorie hurried over to tuck it back around her. She looked at her son over the girl's head, her eyes filled with the kind of worry that only mothers carry. "She needs that medicine, Caleb," she said quietly. "There's no more waiting." He turned toward her, his voice low and tired. "I know, but what do I do when every door's closed? I've tried the bank, the loan office, Even ask Doyle to put it on credit. Nobody cares that she's just a child. Marjorie sighed, lowering herself into a chair. The kettle hissed softly on the stove, filling the silence with a faint whistle. Don't do anything you can't undo. Promise me that much. But Caleb's mind was already running ahead, faster than her words could catch. He pictured Doyle's pharmacy again, the rows of orange bottles, the hum of fluorescent lights, the locked cabinet where the medicine Saturday. He thought of Alara's shallow breaths, the way her small hand felt in his. What was a man supposed to do when love and desperation left him no good choices? He sat back down, burying his face in his hands. Memories surged. Alara's first steps across this very kitchen floor, her laughter when he pushed her on the old swing in the yard, the way she had clung to him when storms rattled the windows at night. Each memory pressed on him like a weight, reminding him of everything he stood to lose. Marjorie placed a trembling hand on his shoulder. Son, listen to me. You can't fight this battle with your fists. You've got to trust there's another way. But as Caleb lifted his head, his eyes betrayed the storm brewing inside. He looked once more at his daughter, curled up with her bare, her breaths uneven, yet stubborn. He couldn't leave her future to chance, not when her present was slipping through his fingers. The wood stove crackled, throwing a brief shower of sparks that faded into the dim air. The church bells sounded again in the distance, solemn, unyielding. Caleb clenched his jaw and rose to his feet, his gaze set toward the door, though he hadn't moved yet. His hand closed into a fist, not from anger but from resolve, as if the world had left him no other path. Caleb tightened his fist, knowing he would have to cross a line tonight. Snow had piled high along the curbs of Main Street, banks of white, broken only by the tracks of late-night cars. The neon signs above the storefronts flickered against the darkness, a tired pulse of color in the frozen quiet. Caleb parked his rusted pickup outside Doyle's pharmacy, the engine coughing before settling into a shudder. For a long moment he didn't move, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles whitened. In the back seat, Alara stirred. Her small face glowed pale in the streetlight, and her breathing rattled faintly, the sound of a child who fought for each inhale. Marjorie held her close, rubbing her back in slow circles, her gaze fixed on her son. No words passed between them, but her eyes spoke a mother's plea. Don't do this. Caleb exhaled, long and heavy, before stepping out. The cold bit into his cheeks as he shut the door. Across the street, Christmas wreaths hung on the diner windows, and inside, patrons laughed over plates of pie. The clink of forks on china carried faintly through the glass. Caleb glanced once at that scene, warmth, community, safety, then turned away, forcing himself toward the harsh, fluorescent glow of the pharmacy. The bell above the door jingled as he entered. The store smelled of disinfectant mixed with cinnamon-scented candles placed out for the season. A rack of holiday cards stood near the counter. Smiling families in front of Christmas trees, cherubic children opening gifts. The images pierced him like needles. His little girl, bundled in the truck outside, didn't need presents. She needed to breathe. Michael Doyle looked up from behind the counter, adjusting his reading glasses. He had the sturdy build of a man who had once played football in high school, but now carried the weight of years behind the register. "Evening, Caleb," he said, his voice cautious but not unkind. "Back again tonight?" Caleb approached his boots, leaving damp prints on the tile. "Mike, I don't have time for pleasantries." "I need that medicine. Alara's worse. Please, just this once. You know me. You know I'll make it right." Doyle sighed, removing his glasses and pinching the bridge of his nose. "You've been coming in all week, Caleb. I told you before without payment there's nothing I can do. My hands are tied. If I bend the rules for you, I lose my license. I lose everything." Caleb's voice cracked, rising with urgency. "And if you don't, I lose my daughter. What am I supposed to do, watch her suffocate?" A heavy silence filled the small shop. The hum of the cooler in the back droned on, indifferent. Doyle glanced toward the shelves, then back at the man standing before him, jaw tight with desperation. His voice softened slightly, though his words remained the same. "I'm sorry. It isn't that I don't care. It's that I can't." Behind Caleb, the door jingled again. A man in a parka entered, shaking snow from his boots before heading down the aisle toward cough drops. The intrusion only deepened Caleb's sense of isolation. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. Don't say you can't. Say you won't. Say you'd rather follow rules than save a child's life. Doyle flinched as if struck. That isn't fair. Fair? Caleb echoed, bitter laughter in his throat. Tell me what's fair about a 6-year-old gasping for air while medicine sits locked behind glass. His eyes locked on the small cabinet behind Doyle's shoulder. The bottles glimmered under the sterile light, so close and yet impossibly far. Doyle shifted on his feet, torn between sympathy and fear. He lowered his voice, as if trying to steady a man standing on the edge of a cliff. Caleb, listen to me. You're a good father. Everyone knows that. But if you go down this road, you can't walk it back. Let me help you find another way. But Caleb's chest tightened with the sense that no other way remained. He thought of every door slammed shut, the bank manager shaking his head, the loan office clerk dismissing him with a smirk, the neighbors offering awkward excuses. All that stood between his daughter and relief was a pane of glass and a man afraid of rules. His hand trembled as it brushed the counter. She doesn't have time for another way. Before Doyle could react, Caleb reached past him, pulling at the latch of the glass cabinet. The small metallic click echoed like thunder. Doyle stumbled backward, his voice cracking. Don't do this. Please, Caleb. The man in the parka at the end of the aisle froze, a box of tissues slipping from his hands. His wide eyes darted between them before he shuffled quickly out the door, the bell above jingling frantically. Caleb grabbed a single bottle, the one with his daughter's name on the label, feeling both triumph and terror pulse through him in the same heartbeat. Please understand, Caleb whispered, voice raw. This isn't theft. This is survival. Doyle, pale with shock, reached for the phone behind the register. His words trembled with regret. You leave me no choice, Caleb. I have to call this in. N. Caleb's heart pounded as he shoved the bottle deep into his coat pocket and pushed through the door into the night air. Snowflakes whipped against his face, the cold shocking his lungs. The neon open sign above flickered, casting red light over his boots as he hurried across the lot. Marjorie's horrified eyes met his as he climbed into the truck. She didn't need to ask, she already knew. Alara stirred in her sleep, murmuring softly as her father gripped the wheel. He started the engine, its rumble too loud in the fragile quiet of Main Street. They had gone less than a block when the wail of sirens tore through the night. Blue and red lights flared in the mirrors, slicing across the snowy road. Caleb's chest collapsed inward as he eased the truck to the side, his hands shaking on the wheel. 2 officers stepped out, their boots crunching on ice, steam rising from their breath. One tapped on the glass with a gloved knuckle. Mr. Whitmore, step out of the vehicle. His tone was calm but final. Caleb obeyed, his movements stiff. Snow crunched beneath his boots as cold steel closed around his wrists. The officer recited his Miranda rights in a steady rhythm that seemed at odds with the terror clawing through Caleb's chest. From the back seat, Alara pressed her tiny palm against the frosted window, her eyes wide and wet with confusion. The flashing red and blue lights painted the snow as Alara whispered, Daddy will come back, right? The morning sun filtered weakly through the gray clouds, casting Davenport in a pale light that carried no warmth. Snowplows rumbled down the streets, clearing paths for holiday shoppers who hurried along with bags tucked under their arms. Bells from street. Pauls rang faintly across the town, reminding everyone it was another Sunday in Advent. For most, the season meant wreaths, hymns, and gatherings. But for the Whitmore family, it meant standing before the law. Scott County Courthouse loomed over the square with its stone facade, tall windows, and the old clock tower that ticked steadily above. Its steps, dusted with snow, bore the tread of lawyers, defendants, and families clutching coats tighter against the cold. Inside, the echo of footsteps mingled with the rustle of papers and the low murmur of voices waiting for their cases to be called. Caleb was led through the corridor, his wrists free now but his pride still bound. His head was lowered, his jaw set. Every step felt like a reminder of how far he had fallen from being the man he once hoped to be. Behind him, Marjorie guided Alara into the courtroom, her small hand clutching the stuffed bear. Alara's eyes darted around the tall chamber, taking in the American flag at the front, the polished benches, and the brass scales of justice mounted high above the judge's seat. They took their places quietly, drawing glances from those seated nearby. Some whispered neighbors who knew the Whitmores by name, who shook their heads in pity or judgment. Caleb kept his eyes forward, refusing to meet their gaze. The bailiff announced the entry of the judge, and all rose as Seraphine Rowland appeared, her wheelchair gliding with practiced ease. Dressed in her black robe, she carried herself with dignity, though her sharp features betrayed little emotion. She was known throughout Scott County as a woman who held the law above all else, a judge who did not flinch before tears or excuses. Yet there was something in the stillness of her gaze that suggested she had weathered storms of her own. Nathaniel Cross, the prosecutor, stood ready at his table, his suit pressed, his papers neatly arranged. At 52, he carried the authority of years in the courtroom, his reputation built on an unwavering faith in the system. To him, rules were not suggestions, they were anchors in a world adrift. He regarded Caleb with a mixture of disdain and determination, already preparing his opening words. At the defense table sat Julian Vega, a young attorney barely out of law school, his tie slightly crooked, his brow damp with nervousness. He shuffled through his notes, glancing often at Caleb as if trying to muster courage from the man he represented. Though inexperienced, there was fire in his eyes, the belief that justice wasn't only about statutes, but about people. The proceedings began with formality, voices echoing against the high ceiling. Cross spoke first, his tone clipped and confident. Your Honor, the facts are not in dispute. The defendant unlawfully entered Doyle's pharmacy, took a controlled substance without consent, and attempted to flee. Theft is theft, regardless of intent. Julian rose hesitantly, his chair scraping the floor. He cleared his throat. Your Honor, yes, my client took the medicine, but he did so out of desperation, not greed. His daughter, a child of 6, was gravely ill. He saw no other way. Surely, compassion should guide our understanding of justice. A murmur rippled through the room. Some nodded in agreement, others frowned. Seraphine listened intently, her face unreadable, her fingers folded neatly in her lap. Caleb sat silent, his eyes fixed on the table before him. He felt the weight of every word spoken, the gulf between his intent and the law stretching wider. His heart pounded each time Alara coughed softly beside her grandmother. Cross adjusted his glasses, turning back to the judge with the confidence of a man who had stood in this place 100 times. Your Honor, I sympathize with hardship. We all do. But society cannot function if desperation becomes an excuse for breaking the law. If we allow theft to go unpunished simply because the thief claims noble intent, we open the door to chaos. The law must be equal for all, firm and unwavering. His words landed with the crispness of winter air. Some in the audience nodded. Others folded their arms uneasily. Julian's hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the table. He leaned forward, his voice steadier now, carried by conviction. But isn't the law meant to protect life above all else? Caleb Whitmore is no criminal mastermind. He is a father, cornered by circumstance, doing what any loving parent might do when every system fails him. Shouldn't justice reflect not just the letter of the law, but the spirit of compassion? The two arguments clashed in the room like cold steel against fire. For a moment, Seraphine let the silence linger. The weight of the courthouse settled over her like a cloak, the history of judgments rendered within these walls pressing down. Her gaze slid toward the defense table. Caleb's posture was rigid, his jaw clenched, but she saw the subtle tremor in his hands as he tried to keep still. His eyes betrayed a man torn between shame and love, between the code of the law and the code of the heart. Then her gaze shifted to the gallery, where Alara sat beside her grandmother. The child's legs barely reached the floor, her bear perched on her lap. Her face was pale, but her eyes, those wide, searching eyes, were fixed not on the lawyers, not on her father, but on Seraphine herself. The judge felt something stir within her chest, a flicker she hadn't allowed in years. She straightened, masking it quickly, but inside she could not deny the pang. She remembered nights of her own spent staring out a window after the accident, convinced that justice meant nothing but rules. Yet here was a child, silent and small, whose very presence unsettled that belief. Cross's voice cut back in, sharp and final. If we bend the law for one man, Judge, then tomorrow 10 more will demand the same mercy, and soon enough, the law itself will mean nothing. The words echoed, steady and unforgiving. Seraphine reached for her gavel, her hand hovering above the polished wood, and in that breath of silence, a sound broke through, soft, almost fragile, but clear enough to reach her ears. Alara leaned closer to her grandmother. her lips barely moving as she whispered, "But what about love?" The courthouse had begun to empty, but the air still carried the weight of what had transpired that morning. Papers rustled, heavy boots echoed on marble, and the large oak doors groaned shut one after another as people trickled out into the snowy afternoon. What remained was silence. That peculiar silence of old courtrooms. Once the crowd has gone, a silence filled with memory. Judge Seraphine Hart sat motionless behind the bench. She had dismissed the proceedings for recess, but she hadn't moved. Her hands rested lightly on the polished mahogany worn by decades of verdicts, her gaze fixed on nothing in particular. Inside her mind, however, a voice replayed again and again, not a lawyer's, not an officer's, but that of a child. But what about love? It was ridiculous, she told herself. A whisper from a 5-year-old should not unsettle a woman trained to weigh life and liberty with strict impartiality. And yet, the words struck at something raw. They reminded her of a truth she had once known before the accident, before the long nights in the wheelchair, before her husband walked away. The snow outside thickened, brushing against the tall windows like salt scattered across glass. The December light dimmed, casting long shadows across the chamber. She shifted in her chair, preparing to return to her chambers. That was when she noticed the small figure at the side entrance. Elara Whitmore had slipped in quietly. Her grandmother must have stepped away to speak with counsel. The girl's winter coat hung half open, boots damp from melted snow, and tucked in the crook of her arm was a teddy bear worn soft by love. She moved with surprising certainty, like someone who knew she belonged where others might hesitate. For a fleeting second, Seraphine considered calling a bailiff. This was no place for children not behind the rail, not before the bench, but she didn't. Something about the child's solemn determination stopped her hand. "You're not supposed to be here, sweetheart," Seraphine said, her voice softer than she meant it to be. "This room is closed." Elara approached slowly, her small boots clicking faintly on the stone floor. She stopped at the base of the bench, lifted her chin, and looked straight up at the judge. Her voice carried, light yet steady. "I know, but I need to tell you something. It can't wait." Seraphine's heart gave a strange flutter. She leaned forward ever so slightly, as if pulled by invisible threads. "And what is it you need to tell me?" Elara hugged the teddy bear tighter, her wide eyes unwavering. "My daddy reads to me every night, even when he's tired and his leg hurts. When I get scared of the dark, he stays until I fall asleep again, sometimes all night. And when I couldn't breathe that night, I saw his hands shaking. But he stayed calm so I wouldn't be scared. He's not a bad man. He's just my dad. And he loves me more than anything." The judge swallowed hard. The words, simple as they were, filled the courtroom with more gravity than any lawyer's plea. She wanted to keep her tone professional, detached, but she found herself whispering instead, "Elara, adults don't always have the choice to follow only their hearts. The law doesn't bend for bedtime stories." Elara frowned, her small brow furrowing. "But sometimes kids see things adults forget." "My Grammy says love makes people do brave things, and brave things aren't the same as bad things." The sentence landed in Seraphine's chest like a crack splitting ice. Brave things. She thought of the night of the accident, the shriek of tires, the crushing weight, the darkness that followed. She thought of the morning she was told she would never walk again. And she thought of the man who had left her, unable to carry her brokenness. Brave things. She had not thought of life in those terms for a long time. The child tilted her head then, her voice lowering to a hush. "You look sad, too. Like maybe you need someone to tell you stories so you won't be afraid of the dark." Seraphine closed her eyes briefly. No attorney, no colleague, no friend had ever spoken to her so directly. And now a child had reached in and touched the one place she guarded most carefully. For several seconds, Judge Seraphine couldn't respond. Her courtroom had heard confessions of guilt and pleas for mercy, but never words that reached her like these. She steadied herself, adjusting her robe with hands that trembled more than she wished to admit. "Elara," she began slowly, "sadness is something adults carry quietly. We live with responsibilities you cannot yet understand. The law—" She hesitated, the familiar phrase sounding brittle on her tongue. "The law does not leave room for feelings. It is cold sometimes. Cruel, even." Elara's gaze didn't waver. She hugged her bear tighter, as though drawing courage from its worn seams. But love isn't a feeling you can lock out. Love makes people brave. My daddy wasn't trying to be bad. He was just trying to save me. That's not breaking the law, that's fixing something broken. Her words echoed in the empty chamber. They landed not like childish whimsy, but like testimony weighted with truth. Seraphine pressed her palms against the armrests of her chair. A familiar ache shot up her spine, reminding her of every boundary her body had drawn since the accident. For years, she had told herself bravery belonged to the past, when she stood tall, when she ran races, when she believed in tomorrow. Since then, she had been only survivor, never believer. Yet this girl dared to say brave things weren't the same as bad things. Her composure cracked. "Why are you telling me this, Ilara?" Her voice was softer than she meant, almost pleading. The little girl stepped closer, her mittened hand resting gently on the polished wood of the bench. "Because Daddy needs someone to believe in him. Everyone else is saying he's wrong, but I know he isn't. He just didn't want me to hurt anymore. And—" She paused, tilting her head, eyes bright with quiet certainty. "You look like you need someone to believe in you too." Seraphine's throat tightened. She wanted to retreat into her role, the black robe, the strict lines of law, but she couldn't. The child's words cracked the armor she had worn for years. For a long moment, the two held each other's gaze, one woman who had buried hope, and one child who still believed in miracles. Then Ilara spoke again, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom like a bell. "If you let my daddy go free, I'll make you walk again." The words hung in the air, impossible to dismiss, echoing against marble and wood as if the building itself had heard a promise too daring to ignore. The words fell like a stone into still water, rippling across every corner of the room. "If you let my daddy go free, I'll make you walk again." For an instant, the grand old courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Dust motes hung in the shafts of winter light, the ticking of the clock on the far wall suddenly loud. No one moved, no one spoke. Seraphine Hart felt the echo of those words in her bones. She gripped the edge of her wheelchair, as though it might steady the tremor building inside her. Her entire career had been about ruling by reason, by precedent, by statute. Yet here was a child, with eyes too earnest to dismiss, offering not argument but miracle. "Ilara!" Marjorie's sharp whisper broke the silence. She hurried down the aisle, her gloved hands outstretched. "Sweetheart, you can't, this isn't come away from there." Her voice cracked between fear and apology, as if she knew her granddaughter had trespassed on sacred ground. Julian Vega, the defense attorney, stared dumbstruck. His tie sat crooked against his shirt collar, his fingers fumbling the edge of his briefcase. He had come prepared to argue compassion, to plead necessity. But this was something no law book had prepared him for. At the other table, Nathaniel Cross slammed his palm against his stack of files, rising with a force that made his chair scrape back sharply. His voice carried, crisp and cutting. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. The child is speaking nonsense, making promises that defy reason. And yet—" He gestured broadly toward Seraphine, his face flushed. "Yet the court is allowing it to stand unanswered. I demand order. This cannot be permitted to sway the judgment." The bailiff stirred uneasily near the door, awaiting instruction. The gallery, half filled with townsfolk who had stayed to watch, shifted in their seats. Some whispered, crossing themselves as if the child had spoken prophecy. Others frowned, shaking their heads in disbelief. Seraphine raised a hand, silencing the commotion. Her voice came low but steady, though inside she felt anything but calm. "This court will have order." She turned her gaze back to Ilara, who had not moved, who stood with her teddy bear pressed to her chest, as if it were armor. "Ilara," the judge said slowly, "what you just promised is impossible. No one can give back what time and injury have taken. Do you understand that?" But the girl's eyes never wavered. "It's not impossible," she said. Her tone was gentle, but it carried with startling clarity. "Love fixes things people say can't be fixed. My daddy loves me enough to be brave. I can love you enough to help you walk." The words, impossibly simple, burrowed into Seraphine's chest, lodging deeper than she wanted to admit. For a fleeting second, she felt a sting behind her eyes, an ache she hadn't allowed since the night of the accident. She blinked it away quickly, straightening her back. Cross exhaled sharply, throwing his arms wide. "Your Honor, I implore you. The court cannot descend into fantasy. The matter at hand is theft, plain and simple. The girl is charming, yes, but the law does not bow to charm, nor to impossible promises. Julian finally found his voice, soft at first, then stronger. But perhaps the law must at least listen to truth, however it comes. Children may not know statutes, but they know sincerity when they speak it. Isn't sincerity evidence of character, Your Honor? Isn't that what we're all really weighing? His words struck a nerve, and Seraphine felt the room lean toward her. Everyone seemed to wait on her next breath. The gallery buzzed with low voices, the air thick with tension, as though the very beams of the courthouse carried the weight of what had been said. Seraphine sat tall, yet inside her body felt fragile, like porcelain that had been glued together too many times. She reminded herself she was Judge Hart, the law's embodiment in Scott County, but her heart refused to obey the script. Cross saw it, and he pounced. "Your Honor," he said, his tone sharp as ice cracking on the Mississippi, "we are drifting dangerously from the matter before us. This is not a church. It is not a fairy tale. It is a court of law. And in this court, we decide on evidence and statute, not the hopeful whispers of a child." His words rang with authority, but his voice carried an edge of desperation, as though he, too, feared how close the child had come to breaching the fortress of reason. Julian rose again, his hands trembling but his eyes fierce. "And yet, Mr. Cross, what is justice, if not the search for truth? Yes, the law is written in black and white, but we live our lives in the gray." Caleb Whitmore broke a statute, but not to enrich himself, not to harm another, but to save his child's breath. Can we really look at him and see only a criminal? Or do we see a father whose love outweighed his fear of consequence? He looked toward the bench, and for a moment the tremor in his hands stilled. "Your Honor, isn't love itself the evidence that matters most?" A hush fell. Marjorie clutched Alara's shoulders tightly, as if to draw her back, but the little girl slipped free, her eyes never leaving Seraphine's. The judge's lips parted, but no words came. She felt as though the walls of the courthouse were closing in, not from pressure but from memory. Nights alone, the creak of her wheelchair, the echo of her husband's absence. She had built her life upon rules, because rules could not abandon her, but love, that fragile, unpredictable force she had buried long ago. And now it stood before her in the form of a child with snow still melting on her boots. Cross's voice cut back in, pressing hard. "Your Honor, if you yield to this sentiment, you set a precedent that will unravel the very fabric of justice in this county. Think of the chaos, every thief pleading desperation, every wrong excused by a sob story. Are we prepared to govern by tears instead of law?" The words cracked like a whip, yet Seraphine barely heard them. Her gaze lingered on Alara, who still clutched her bear with quiet dignity. Then the child spoke again, not loud, but clear enough for the entire chamber to hear. Her voice was steady, carrying a weight beyond her years. "But what about love?" she asked, her small voice piercing the silence. The question hung there, impossible to dismiss, turning every head, silencing every argument, leaving even the judge's gavel heavy and unused in her hand. The words still floated in the air, small, fragile, but somehow heavier than the gavel itself. But what about love? The old courthouse, with its tall windows and echoing rafters, seemed to pause. Even the flags on either side of the bench hung motionless, as if time itself leaned in to hear the answer. Seraphine's throat constricted. She had spent years defining herself, not by what she had lost, but by the law she upheld. Love had been a luxury she discarded the day her husband left, a word she avoided because it carried more pain than promise. And now, in the most unlikely place, it had been placed back before her like evidence in a trial. Her eyes dropped briefly to her lap, to the wheels of her chair gleaming under the pale light. She had accepted them as permanent, as part of her identity. Yet the child's eyes, clear, certain, undimmed by cynicism, made her question truths she thought immovable. Caleb sat rigid at the defense table, his hands clasped so tightly they shook. He had weathered shame before unpaid bills, hard stares in town. His name whispered his failure, but never this. His daughter standing in open court, her faith laid bare for all to see. He longed to tell her to sit down, to stop shouldering what should be his burden. Yet he couldn't. His voice would have cracked. Marjorie dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, muttering softly, "Lord, watch over this child." Cross cleared his throat, trying to reclaim authority. "Your Honor," he began, his tone tight. "The court cannot allow itself to be derailed by sentimentality. This case must be decided on fact, not on the wishful notions of a little girl." But his words rang hollow. The gallery, once restless, now sat in rapt silence. Even the bailiff seemed reluctant to break the spell. Julian Vega rose slowly, almost reverently, his voice calm, measured. "Mr. Cross is right about one thing: law must be built on fact. But perhaps we've mistaken fact for something sterile. Fact is also that Caleb Whitmore is a father whose every action revolves around his child's survival. Fact is that Elara, at 6 years old, stands braver than most men twice her age. And fact is, Your Honor, that love has driven countless acts of courage in this country we call home. Can we truly dismiss it here, in this courtroom?" His words did not thunder. They settled gently, like snowfall blanketing the courthouse square, leaving their mark in stillness. Seraphine lifted her gaze again. She met Alara's eyes, and in them she saw not naivety but conviction, the kind she herself had once carried before bitterness took its place. The judge's fingers brushed the gavel, but she did not lift it. Instead, she whispered under her breath, barely audible, "What about love?" Indeed, the air in the chamber seemed charged, as though the child's words had awakened something larger than the trial itself. Outside, the wind rattled against the tall courthouse windows, snow sweeping across the square. Inside, not a soul stirred. Caleb lowered his head, shame burning in his chest. He had always imagined himself as protector, provider, the one to shield his daughter from the world's cruelties. Yet here he sat helpless, branded as a thief, watching his little girl shoulder the burden he should have carried. His throat ached with unshed words. "I'm sorry, Elara. I should have been stronger." "You shouldn't have to save me." Seraphine glanced toward him, reading the defeat etched into his features. For the first time, she felt not just the defendant and his crime, but the man and his desperation. It unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Cross broke the silence with clipped precision. "Your Honor, may we return to the matter at hand? The defendant's guilt is not in question. The longer we indulge this spectacle, the further we stray from justice." But the word justice rang differently now. Seraphine felt the weight of it shift. Was justice the rigid application of law, or was it something deeper, something the law could never fully capture? Julian leaned forward, his young voice steady despite his nerves. "Justice isn't blind, Your Honor. It sees not only the act, but the heart behind it. If we refuse to see love here, then perhaps it is the law that has failed us, not Caleb Whitmore." The gallery hummed, low but insistent, like an old church congregation stirred by a preacher's words. Some nodded, some frowned, but all were listening. Elara stepped closer to the bench once more, her small hand brushing the polished wood. "Daddy's not perfect," she said softly, "but he never lets me be afraid alone. Maybe rules are important, but love is more important. You know that, don't you?" Seraphine's chest tightened. She wanted to deny it, to silence the child's plea, but the words had already breached her defenses. She thought of nights alone in her silent house, of the echo of her own loneliness. She thought of the chair beneath her, the weight of permanence she had accepted. Her fingers hovered above the gavel. All eyes were upon her. She felt the enormity of the moment pressing down, threatening to crack the identity she had so carefully built. Instead of striking the bench, she whispered more to herself than to anyone, "Perhaps the law has forgotten something." The room leaned in, waiting. Caleb raised his head slowly, his eyes searching hers for any glimmer of hope. And Seraphine, staring at the child before her, realized she stood at the edge of a decision that could change not just Caleb's life, but her own. Snow kept falling outside, soft and endless, covering the square in white silence. Inside courtroom 5, the world seemed suspended, as though time itself waited for Judge Seraphine Hart to speak. Her hand still rested on the gavel, but she could not bring it down. The wood beneath her palm was smooth, polished by decades of judgments. She had always believed the gavel was her anchor, her shield, the one tool that gave her voice finality. Yet in that moment, it felt unbearably heavy, as though to strike it would crush something fragile blooming inside her chest. She looked toward Caleb. The man's shoulders were slumped, his eyes shadowed by exhaustion and shame. He seemed prepared to accept whatever sentence was handed down, so long as it kept his daughter safe from further spectacle. Yet beneath the weariness, Seraphine saw the spark of love, raw, stubborn, undeniable, that had driven him into Doyle's pharmacy in the first place. Then her gaze drifted to Alara. The child still stood bravely before the bench, her mitten dangling from one hand, her teddy bear clutched in the other. Snowmelt dampened her boots, but she didn't seem to notice. Her face glowed with a certainty that unsettled every adult in the room. Seraphine felt her composure waver. In Ilara's eyes, she glimpsed something she had buried long ago. Faith. Faith that broken things could be mended, that losses were not always permanent, that love was stronger than law. Her breath caught as memory surged. She was back in the hospital room after the accident, the sterile smell of antiseptic burning her nose, the flat voices of doctors telling her she would never walk again. She remembered her husband's silence, the way he stood at the foot of the bed, unable to meet her eyes, until one day, he simply did not come back. She remembered swearing that she would never again be ruled by love, only by order, only by law. But now, a child's whisper had undone years of resolve. Nathan Cross shifted at the prosecutor's table, his impatience clear. Your Honor, with respect, this case is not about your reflections. It is about a man who broke the law. We cannot allow sentiment to rewrite justice. The words snapped her back, but they no longer struck with the same force. For the first time in years, Seraphine doubted the certainty of men like Nathan Cross. Julian rose slowly. His youth showed in the tremor of his voice, but his conviction steadied him. Maybe justice isn't only about punishment. Maybe it's about restoration. Maybe it's about seeing people as more than the worst decision they've ever made. The room stirred. Even the bailiff, who had stood stone still, seemed to shift his weight uneasily, as though aware that history was being written before his eyes. Seraphine's gaze returned to Alara, who lifted her little chin and whispered, almost like a vow, "You don't have to be afraid of love." The word struck her deeper than any argument could. Her fingers tightened on the gavel, but she could not yet decide whether to raise it or let it fall. The silence deepened, the kind of silence that makes every breath, every shuffle of paper, every creak of wood sound thunderous. Outside, the courthouse bells tolled the quarter hour, their chimes muffled by the snow but resonant in the bones of everyone present. Caleb bowed his head, unable to meet his daughter's eyes. He feared that his love had burdened her with too much weight, too much faith. She believes I am worth saving, he thought bitterly. But what if I'm not? His chest tightened with the shame of a man who had failed at everything but loving his child. Marjorie squeezed Alara's shoulder, whispering urgently for her to sit back down, but the little girl stood her ground. Her courage was so disarming that even the seasoned bailiff hesitated to move her. Nathan Cross adjusted his glasses, his frustration simmering. Your Honor, he said with clipped precision, we are at risk of turning this court into a theater. The people of Scott County expect rulings based on law, not sentiment. If you allow this display to sway your judgment, then we invite chaos into our courts. His words should have carried authority, but they hung flat, as though stripped of their power. Julian, by contrast, found strength in the stillness. He stepped forward, his voice steady now. Your Honor, perhaps the people of this county expect more than rigid statutes. Perhaps they expect justice that feels human. A father who risks everything for his child is not a danger to this community. He is the reason communities endure. Seraphine's hand trembled as she touched the gavel. It was supposed to be so simple. Hear the facts, apply the law, pronounce the verdict. Yet her heart pounded with another truth, one she had long denied. Her eyes drifted again to Alara. The child met her gaze without flinching, her voice a whisper that carried like thunder. You know he's not bad. You know love matters more. The words pierced her carefully built armor. For a moment, Seraphine was not Judge Hart, guardian of statutes, but simply a woman who remembered what it was to be loved and what it was to lose it. The gavel shook in her hand. She raised it slightly, then lowered it again, unable to strike. Her voice, when it came, was hushed but resolute. This court, she began, then stopped, her throat tightening. She looked once more at the child, then at the father, then at the rows of townspeople watching. This court must decide whether law alone is enough. The room leaned forward, hearts caught between dread and hope, waiting for words that could change everything. And then Seraphine drew in a trembling breath, preparing to speak a judgment unlike any she had ever given. The courthouse felt as though it were holding its breath. Outside, snow fell thicker, wrapping Davenport in a muffled hush, as though the town itself knew history was about to be made within these walls. Judge Seraphine Hart sat straighter in her chair, but the tremor in her hands betrayed her calm exterior. For years, she had relied on the law's rigidity to steady her, to define her, but now the law felt like a brittle shield, one that might shatter under the weight of a little girl's faith. She looked at Caleb. The man's eyes were tired, darkened with sleepless nights and heavy regrets. Yet even in defeat, his gaze flickered toward Alara, and in that flicker was something Seraphine could not ignore. A father's love, unbreakable, even in chains. Marjorie clutched her granddaughter's shoulders, whispering prayers under her breath. Ilara, however, stood fearless before the bench, her small frame bathed in the pale winter light filtering through the tall windows. Her teddy bear dangled at her side, forgotten, as she fixed her gaze on the judge with the clarity of someone who still believed in miracles. Nathan Cross cleared his throat, seizing the silence. "Your Honor, I must insist, this case is not a referendum on hope or faith or sentiment. It is theft, plain and simple. If we bend the law here, we invite lawlessness tomorrow. The people demand consistency." His words echoed like iron on stone, sharp, unyielding. But Julian Vega rose quietly, his voice carrying a gentler weight. "The people also demand humanity, Mr. Cross. They demand compassion. We cannot call ourselves just if we punish love as though it were greed. Caleb Whitmore broke the law, yes, but not the spirit of justice. To condemn him would be to condemn every parent who has ever sacrificed for their child." The words sank deep, and the gallery shifted, some nodding, others whispering. Seraphine pressed her lips together. She could feel her heart pulling her in two directions, the rigid lines of statute on one side, the unshakable plea of love on the other. For the first time in years, she admitted to herself that she was afraid not of failure, but of choosing wrong in a way the law could never measure. Her hand lifted the gavel. The room froze. Caleb's breath hitched. Ilara's eyes widened, shining with a trust that felt unbearable to hold. "This court," Seraphine began, her voice steady but trembling beneath the surface, "has heard the arguments, weighed the facts, and seen the evidence." She paused, her eyes flicking once more to the child who had dared to speak of miracles. The silence deepened, stretching taut, ready to snap. And just as the gavel hovered above the bench, she whispered words that no one expected. "But perhaps the evidence we needed most has come from the smallest voice in this room. Oh." The words seemed to hang in the air, fragile, yet impossible to ignore. The smallest voice in this room. Seraphine let her gaze linger on Alara, who stood so bravely beneath the weight of so many watching eyes. For a moment, the judge saw not just a child, but the very embodiment of the thing she had long denied. Hope. Her hand trembled as she lowered the gavel. "Caleb Whitmore," she said, her voice steady now, "the law declares you guilty of theft. But justice—" She paused, her throat tightening. "Justice demands we see the heart behind the act." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Cross shook his head furiously, his papers rattling. "Your Honor, this is unprecedented." But Seraphine continued, unshaken. "This court acknowledges that you acted out of love for your child, not malice. Therefore, instead of prison, you will serve probation and community service, assisting in the very pharmacy you once wronged. You will repay your debt not behind bars, but by helping the community you are part of. Let this be your chance at redemption." The gavel struck once, the sound resonant, final. Caleb closed his eyes, tears burning his lashes. It was not freedom in the fullest sense, but it was mercy, a path to repair instead of destruction. For the first time in years, he felt the faint stirrings of hope. Marjorie wept openly, pulling Alara into her arms. Yet the child slipped free and ran to her father, clinging to his waist as if to anchor him to the world. "I knew you'd come back," she whispered, her voice muffled in his coat. Seraphine watched them, her chest tightening with something she had not allowed herself in years, longing. The room blurred for a moment, and she blinked hard, refusing to let tears fall in public. Ilara turned suddenly, her small voice ringing through the chamber, not as a plea this time, but as a promise. "See, Judge Lady? Love fixes things." The words struck her deeper than any argument had, and though her legs remained still beneath the robe, for the first time since the accident, Seraphine felt something stir not in her body, but in her soul. A faint warmth. A step taken not by feet, but by heart. As the crowd began to file out, whispers rising like wind through trees, Seraphine stayed at the bench, her hand resting lightly on the gavel. She had not healed. Not yet. But perhaps healing began not with miracles, but with choosing mercy, choosing connection, choosing love. And for the first time in years, Judge Seraphine Hart allowed herself a quiet, almost imperceptible smile. There are stories we carry with us long after the courthouse lights go out and the echoes of the gavel fade. This one lingers because it wasn't just about a man standing trial or a judge weighing the letter of the law. It was about a child's voice, clear, steady, and full of love, that reminded everyone in the room what truly matters. Sometimes, it takes the smallest voice to reveal the greatest truths. What we witnessed through Caleb, Ilara, and Judge Seraphine was not a tale of perfection, but a journey of mistakes, regrets, and the fragile courage to ask for forgiveness. It was the recognition that broken people can still heal, not just themselves, but each other, when they choose love over pride, compassion over rules. For anyone who has ever felt the weight of a wrong decision or the distance of a family bond stretched too thin, this story offers hope. The past can be mended. The future can still be shaped with gentleness. The heart of it is simple, though not easy. Love redeems. Love can soften the sternest judgments and give new life to those who believe their best days are behind them. And isn't that something all of us, especially in our later years, understand more deeply than ever? The way a grandchild's laughter can brighten a weary day, or how gathering around the dinner table passing mashed potatoes and iced tea reminds us that family is the anchor when everything else feels uncertain. The lesson here is timeless. Unconditional kindness can change the course of a life. Everyone deserves love and a family, no matter their mistakes. Human dignity is worth more than wealth or position. Sometimes, all it takes is a second chance to reveal the best in us. Happiness does not arrive through success or applause, but when we decide to live for one another. Just like a porch light glowing at dusk in a quiet neighborhood, a simple act of mercy can guide us through the darkest stretches of the road. For those of us looking back on decades lived, perhaps the story is less about Caleb's trial and more about our own quiet reckonings. The moments we wish we could change, the bridges we long to rebuild, the words of forgiveness left unsaid. And maybe, like Seraphine, we learn that healing doesn't always come with thunder and miracles, but through small choices to trust love again. So tonight, I invite you to take a moment. Think of the people who have shaped your life, the ones you still hold close in memory or in hand. Think of the meals shared, the church bells rung, the stories told on porches while the crickets sang. And ask yourself, where might love still need to do its work? If this story touched your heart, I'd love for you to leave a gentle mark here. Press the number 1 if it spoke to you, or 0 if you'd like to share your thoughts or suggestions. Either way, your presence and reflection matter. Because in the end, it isn't the gavel that leaves the deepest echo. It is the steady, unshaken truth that love, when we let it, has the power to set us free.